Hi, everyone. My name is John McDonald. I'm an American playwright, and I believe in a woman's right to choose. And you are listening to Everything is Gay, Even the Straight Stuff, the podcast where we examine things in pop culture. And I'm joined by my effervescent, magical, usual co host, Magnus. Hi, Magnus.
Greetings, greetings.
Greetings. Now, let's start off with a very fair question. If you could be a character into the woods, which character would you want to be, or which one are you drawn to when you think about Into the Woods?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Um, I think if I was drawn to any particular character, it would have to be the witch herself. And the reasoning behind that is I feel by the end of the film, she is the only person that's truly grasped the very meaning of what's been happening. Um,
And she's one
it
of the only main characters who doesn't die in the film. So,
Well, no, she does because she turns herself into a puddle.
not in every version. In some of them, she just walks, well, she kind of jumps off screen or off stage. So she doesn't turn into a puddle in all of them. And some of them, she just kind of leaves. It depends on which version you're watching.
She goes, "Screw this crap, I'm off."
I mean, that's basically what Last Midnight is about. She's like, y'all don't seem to understand there are consequences to your actions, and you're blaming everyone but yourselves, and you're creating a literal witch hunt. And so I've had enough of this. I'm gonna go.
As she puts it. So I do feel she's the one that I connect the most with, because to be fair, the others are mostly moronic for various reasons, very self-absorbed. But that's
Yeah.
just me generalizing. What
Well,
about
and
yourself?
she's actively a creepy character too. Josh Groban's versions of her songs from Into the Woods he did on stages when
Mm,
he did Not While I'm Around and Children Will Listen. Him and Meryl Streep in the 2014 film um, really understand how creepy the witch is. Like they do a
mm,
really good job with all of the minor chords and making what essentially could be a lullaby into like a very, very um, attachment heavy, creepy song.
mm.
It's very close to like for people that have not great home lives. You start hearing it, and you're like, oh, this is my family life. This is not great. Um,
It's almost a bit gothical, you could almost say.
well, she is the Mother
Yes.
Gothel of this
Mm.
universe because
Yes,
technically she
indeed.
raises Rapunzel. It's a pretty classic Rapunzel trope that the witch
Mm.
is fairly interconnected. It also amuses me to no end that the baker and his wife just take what she says at face value because she's a witch. Like they're terrified of her, but they also have no idea that she's basically sending them to make a spell for her. They really like they take her at her word after she describes how she has made their family infertile. It's a wild show and it's a wild relationship.
Mm. We that kind of relates to the whole thing of consequences and such. Well, the fact is they don't realize the consequences of what they're doing by gathering those ingredients. But before we go into that, let me ask you the same question. Which character do you most relate to?
I mean, I like to think I'm Cinderella and I'd end up with Chris Pine, but in reality, I'm probably Little Red Riding Hood, sending Jack on his journey that creates the whole second act problem. Um, yeah, I'm probably sociopathic enough to be a character that comes on screen um, the third time wearing a wolf pelt, because in the stage play, probably not in the high school versions, but in the stage play on stage, 9 times out of 10, after the wolf is dead, she comes back on screen wearing his pelt, um, which is
Savage.
savage. I mean, she didn't murder him, the baker did, and the baker didn't do it for altruistic reasons. The baker did it to get the cape. The cape is red as
Hmm.
blood. Oh God, I'm that song stuck in my head all day. But yeah, no, I aspire to be a Cinderella, but let's be real, I'm probably a Little Red Riding Hood.
Is there some aspect of taking on part of his identity by wearing his skin? Red Riding Hood in a sense, takes the wolf's role. Not that she's going to prey on other little girls, I
Yeah.
mean here, but she's sort of like claiming um, something of him to show that she's sort of, I don't know, moved past him or has conquered him
Well,
almost.
Red Riding Hood's story is about it's a really heavy-handed allegory
Mm,
for maturity and
mm,
for owning your own sexuality in a lot of ways. Because the whole conceit of the wolf, which is why it's great that KGZ87 played the wolf in a
mm,
production of Into the Woods, and kind of weird that Johnny Depp was cast as the wolf into the Into the Woods film that Disney did, is the idea that um, the wolf devours and then taking on the guise of the wolf and owning that mistake, but then, you know, turning around in the first act of your adulthood is blaming others for your failure and sending Jack back up the beanstalk. It's very much like an allegory for adulthood. It's very that. Um, I think that was one of the few castings in the Disney adaptation I really liked was the actress they cast as Little Red, and she's one of the few cast members that wasn't well known. That
mm,
wasn't kind of this big cast idealized. This is who we're going to tell you about kind of thing. But I
mm.
think I wouldn't say her songs are the most challenging, but I think for the amount of screen time she has, she's one of the more compelling characters. And anything that means I have to see less James Corden, I'm here for. So
Oh, oh wow! Now that's a whew, bit of divisive topic. It's strange. It does seem to be a bit of a Marmite thing with him. You either like James Corden, you can't stand him. To the
yeah.
point where I've had friends tell me they refuse to go near certain films or productions because they don't want to see him. And yes, that seems a bit of a childish remark to make, but some people really don't like seeing him on the screen.
I mean, I don't actively avoid things he's in, but I can't remember the last thing where I saw James Corden. I was like, I need to sit down and watch this. The 2014 draw for me was Anna Kendrick as Cinderella, Meryl Streep
Mm,
as the witch, and
yeah.
Chris Pine as one of the princes. Um, so for me, also Tracey Ullman as Jack's mom. I was
Mm,
really surprised, but I was not. I didn't hate the casting of Tracey Ullman. It was nice to see her doing American stuff again.
mm.
Yeah, no, this is one of the things that was left on the Christmas episode cutting room floor was the long diatribe conversation that we had about James Corden. Because I just couldn't fit it in anywhere, and I couldn't fit in most of the stuff about In the Woods, which is why we're talking about it right now. Also, because it is one of my favorite Sondheim shows. I don't talk about it as incessantly as I talk about Company, but there is something about Into the Woods. I find it odd that high schools perform Into the Woods when they have trouble performing things like Rent. And I find it odd that people think this is not as viscerally alarming as Sweeney Todd. I actually find this almost slightly more visceral as a play than Sweeney. Um, and I find it weird that high schools do it because this is such a weird sexualized play. This is like the wolf has the wolf's tail is supposed to look kind of like a penis in a lot of the costume choices. The talk about infertility, the adultery that
Mm,
happens in the open, literally into the woods, which is why the baker's wife has to be killed in one of the best mid-act songs of probably anything. Um, yeah, I find this odd that high schools would choose to do this. It's almost like they see fairy tale and they don't realize that it's a story of
yeah.
choice and abuse and captivity and things like that. Like, wow.
Dare I say, maybe it's sort of this is the sort of fairy tale play that's an that's an English literature major's dream because it's a fairy tale, but because it's being very anti fairy tale in
Yeah.
many of its approaches, it's sort of like almost it's the perfect thing that a teacher will look at and go, oh, this is going to be great because it's got all these sorts of themes worked into it. It's got and it goes in depth beneath the surface. It sort of feels like that, and like if you told it to a teacher, they would get very enthusiastic about it. Um, before you start going into,
Yeah.
as you say, those more contentious issues and topics.
Yeah, but unlike something like Merchant of Venice, it doesn't get protested when people hear it's coming. Like people get excited about Into the Woods,
Uh,
which I can't blame them. Into the Woods is a really great show. It's a hard
mm,
show. Definitely Stephen
yes.
Sondheim doing his most to make an ensemble cast work for it.
Mm,
Um, yeah, it's one of those really interesting shows where I want to be in the show, and there are so many roles I could play that I
mm,
would have such a good time playing. Um, and it's a really interesting show. It's a really interesting thing to adapt to
mm,
because audiences kind of have to be trained into thinking about a critique of fairy tales. Because in '86, when
yes.
it was in San Diego, when it started out, I think it was in San Diego. I pulled up the history of it. So it went to Broadway first in '87, and then Phantom was like in its heyday in '87. So most of the awards that it should have won for the year it premiered, it didn't get because everyone was still gaga over Phantom.
Mm,
Um, yeah, premiered at the Old Globe Theater in San Diego early December in 1986. So the play is just a
wow.
little bit younger than me, and it ran for 50 performances under
Hmm.
the direction of James Lapine, who, if you get the playbill, his name is in the playbill, as I think he's the director of it traditionally seen. Him and Stephen Sondheim have like equal billing on this, which is really great.
Mm,
Um, yeah.
wow. I was going to ask if you'd ever gone and seen it in Broadway.
Well, I don't have Broadway money, but I would love to see it in a traveling cast. This is one of those great Broadway shows where you don't need big name actors to carry it. It has had
Mm,
big name actors. Bernadette Peters and Marin Mazzie have both played the witch. Anna Kendrick finally played Cinderella in one of the different versions of Cinderella Broadway has ever done. And I think particularly Anna Kendrick, with her kind of brassy jazz voice, does
mm,
really well as a Cinderella type. And I'm trying to think of like other people who have played. It's one of those things where it's really great that it's such a heavily ensemble cast. It's one of the few things that Stephen Sondheim does better than almost any other. When I
mm,
say it's visceral, um, I'm talking specifically about songs like Last Midnight and First Midnight, where the
mm.
witch actually uses words like boom splat in rhythm to music, which is really great and something Sweeney Todd doesn't even dare do.
The main song, as you say, Into the Woods, it does stick in my memory, not just for the words, but also visually, going back to the film, because I think it does a very good job at tying together all of the um, individual players, the main players, the stage is set, they're all singing their different parts, and it's sort of like weaving the threads together. And the fact that visually you can see them actually beginning to venture into the woods, where they're all conjugate, they'll all converge together and create this very tangled mess, um, which will lead to all of these unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's really great because
Right.
it's kind of the opposite of the It's a Small World ride, whereas It's a Small World ride started out as a lullaby and something very soft. If you've ever heard the piano version of It's a Small World, it's not
Mm,
upbeat or happy. It's actually almost minor,
mm,
minor key for all the piano people out there. But Into the Woods starts out joyful, almost frantic in its joy. People are wishing for
mm,
things.
mm.
They're
Yes.
not quite in major key. If you listen to how altos sing this show, especially, it really feels like you're almost in minor key, which is usually what people think of when they think of like sadder
Mm,
songs or really haunting melodies. And so there's this really great kind of almost fever pitch. They're wishing for
mm.
something, no matter the cost, by the way. Um, and
Yes.
I think it was Stephen Sondheim, someone famously said that everybody in this play is a fairy tale character except the baker and his wife. They're actually real world people responding to fairy tale in time. And I think it was Stephen Sondheim that said that he wrote that with the intention of Like they're the only real people in the play, and everyone else is really playing a version of a character. Um, and I cannot remember when that interview happened, but that was something that was kind of
Mm.
expressed. And I think James Corden and Emily Blunt kind of took that to a degree. So
To get to the crux of what the film's about, as you say, it's about wishing. It's the wishes and desires of this diverse cast of characters, and they're after something that they're after things that will they believe will make them happy, will bring joy to their lives, and that's why, as a play, this whole plot works quite well because the first part is they're reaching for their wishes, they're fulfilling their desires, and it accumulates into the happy part of happy ever after. Then the second part really is the ever after part. Um, and yeah, they need to learn the consequences. A really good line from Once Upon a Time is all magic comes with a price, dearie, by the fabulous Rumpel. I mean, Regina always stole the show, but you have to admit that Robert Carlyle did such a great job at creating a very memorable version of Rumpelstiltskin to the
he would
point that
be he would be really good as the wolf in this, I think. I feel like
oh
as a wolf, especially if you're gonna do kind of a Johnny Depp almost non-sexualized wolf, Robert
yeah,
Carlyle would be a really great wolf. Uh,
but oh yeah, well, Robert Carlyle the actor. Yes, I was about to say if you're going to say you're going to drop Rumpelstiltskin into the woods,
I mean, you could
I
drop
think
Rumple into the woods. I feel like you could make him the narrator, and the idea of
yeah,
sacrificing him to the giantess works really well, personally for me.
yeah, yes. But you say non-sexualized. I'm sorry, sir, but you forget that Rumpel was perhaps the premier ladies' man of Once Upon a Time. Somehow, I mean, they made
Yeah.
it an in joke in season 6,
Well, he's
where
he's
he
kind of like a Bronson Pinchot, where there's
mm,
an effeminacy to him, but there's also this kind of weird shark in the water type vibe
yes,
to him. And so when we talk about Once Upon a Time, we can definitely
mm,
talk about
yeah,
that more, because especially casting for me in Once Upon a Time is what almost made or break some of the seasons, and I have specific feelings about Robert Carlyle as Rumple. Um, and here's
mm,
something interesting. When we talk about Into the Woods in 2014, when I was looking at research, a lot of people talk about how this Disney film in 2014, how it quote unquote fails as an adaptation.
mm,
Um, and a lot of people like really take umbrage with things that were changed. But I gotta
mm,
tell you, it's not out of tradition to change things when you adapt things. And I
mm,
can think that
yeah,
Rob Marshall, who adapted Chicago for film and everybody loved, and then Nine, which nobody saw, and then did this kind of in a row of sequence. So Rob Marshall does Chicago in 2002. Everybody loves it. He does Nine in 2009. No one sees it. And then it's Into the Woods in 2014.
mm,
And so he's learned some lessons from adapting things like Chicago, and choices he made that were very well applauded. But he's also learned from things like Little Shop of Horrors. And what I
mm,
mean by that is that Into the Woods, the stage play, has a very clear one act, two-act structure to it. It's very much a clear fairy tale where you get end of act one is a happy ending,
yeah,
act two is the consequences. In the film, it feels like the baker's wife's death is more of the end of act one than the actual end of act one, because they show it. They show Cinderella getting married to the prince. They show everyone getting their happy ever after and that. But for me, when I think of Into the Woods, the film, I
yeah,
almost feel like he was taking the idea of Audrey and Seymour from Little Shop and the lessons they learned making that Broadway show into a film. Um, and he was creating kind of the crux of the story around the baker and his wife, and making it slightly
mhm,
less ensemble, because we don't see the prince and his steward. We don't see the royal families again, except for
no,
Billy Magnuson and Rapunzel. Um, so there's some changes to it, and there's more of a focus on the people. which is why the ending of Little Shop of Horrors was changed because test audiences hated that Audrey and Seymour die to the plant and everyone gets eaten. Test audiences hated that. Like they wanted to see people survive and live. And so it's kind of an
Mhm.
interesting thing where the thing people hate about Into the Woods, the film adaptation, is the thing they love about Little Shop of Horrors and some of what they love about Chicago, of how things are changed and
Mhm.
adapted. And you have to think about it like this: like if you've ever seen Into the Woods, the stage play, even like the YouTube versions, because there are a couple
Yeah.
versions on YouTube where the whole
Mhm.
show is there. You really get
Yes.
the sense that in Into the Woods the play, it's a play. You know you're seeing a play. It's almost a panto. It's almost like that Christmas British tradition of showing
Mm.
a thing where it's very much about the fact that you've come to watch a play, the fact you've come to hear characters sing. It's not about the realism of the thing. It's about the crazy witch. It's about people going into the woods. It's about a cow that is definitely not alive, and that's okay. Um, but this, almost taking it to film, you almost get a sense that Rob Marshall wanted something more 3D. He keeps a lot of aspects. He keeps like the idea of the woods at night, which you see often when you get a playbill for Into the Woods. You'll see kind of the moon and the trees being in the foreground and letting you know you're going to be in a forest. Except for the original London production where it was first done, where they have the wolf with a shopping bag in his mouth, which is kind of weird. Um, but yeah, so Rob Marshall, who is kind of a rising star of film musicals, especially Disney ones, because he did
Mm.
Mary Poppins Returns and he's doing the new Little Mermaid.
Mm.
He made some choices, but I don't think they were bad necessarily. I would argue that even though Emily Blunt isn't the best singer, she's very serviceable. Her
Mm.
version of her death song, which I always forget the name of this actual song. I call it the Baker's Wife death song because that's what it is.
Mm.
Um, but it's what is it? Any Moment. I think her version of Any Moment actually works, and especially where it's placed in the show and how she's filmed, which is maybe lessened in the stage play. I
Mm.
really feel like it's more successful than people want it to be, and I think as time goes further away from its actual premiere, that people that see the film again will come to love it for more than just Chris Pine and Billy Magnuson ripping their shirt on a waterfall. Which I still love it for. I'm not mad about it, like in any way, shape, or form. Let me be absolutely clear. But like, I feel like time will be
Mm.
kinder to this version of In the Woods than we have been personally.
Yes. No, I definitely agree with you there. We will touch upon the brothers' hypermasculine strutting shortly.
Oh, it's so good. I love it.
um,
Billy Magnuson
I
and Chris
do.
Pine were made for that, by the way. And Chris Pine knows what he's doing because he had played James Tiberius Kirk for
Yes.
for a couple movies after that. Like he knew what he was doing in character, and that's not him in real life at all, which is why it makes me so amused. So
Well, sir, it's acting. It's a sign of a great actor that
yeah,
they can adopt a role. I mean, if we're going to go on about actors like Johnny Depp, they've always said that he's a great character actor, but I can't help but feel that sometimes he's so skilled at playing
yeah.
quirky, out there roles that I don't know if that necessarily shows his range sometimes. But sorry, that's just a
No,
stray
no,
observation.
no.
Um,
It's okay because I think Johnny Depp is actually more of a mime or a clown actor than he is like a traditional actor.
hmm,
I think he learned a lot from Tim Burton about body language, but I feel
yeah,
like that hurt his ability to necessarily do
hmm,
dialogue. I feel like he's better in something like Edward Scissorhands than he is in Into the Woods, for
yeah,
instance. I feel like he's better as Edward than he was in one of as he was in the Mad Hatter. Like he was better. Yeah, I feel like he's better as the only movie that I really loved him in was Sleepy Hollow versus Christina Ricci. Like playing into that weird Tim Burton-esque thing really worked. And I know he was Sweeney Todd, but I have feelings about Sweeney Todd as a show, which we'll have to talk about at some other point. which
Mm,
is another Sondheim show, but completely different. Um,
mm.
yeah, no, I always
No,
think when I think about Johnny Depp, I think about like a body language actor more than necessarily like a verbal actor.
mm, yes. So touching upon what you were speaking about before, um, the so the second act begins. The consequences come back and forth to basically overturn everything that's been built
Yeah,
up. And you went on about the baker's wife and such. I feel from the point at the start of the second act up to her moment of death, like it's all frenetic, it's all chaotic. In a sense, her death is the culmination of the consequences finally coming out in force. It's the breaking point. And so I can see what you're saying there, that it sort of feels that that is the true ending of Act One.
well, and
It's
in the
you could almost say it's like, you know, uh, the second act has two parts to it: the chaotic consequences, and then the the blame game
yeah.
begins, sort of thing.
Well,
Um,
and in the stage show, she's killed by the giantess, and in the film adaptation, she just falls. Like she's not killed by the giantess in the film adaptation. She just like falls into the woods, and it's just like a magic death. Like, and
mm,
unlike Meryl Streep, where it's this drawn out thing where she turns into like a puddle of tar or whatever it is, and that helps kill the giantess. No, the baker's wife is just flat out just murdered, just like
mm.
by the woods. She just falls.
Yeah,
She literally falls to her death.
you have to ask yourself, like, what it would be the better version then. Like, it sounds weird to say what would be the better version of seeing a character perish. Um, but I mean, on one hand, as you say, the giantess who's been wronged by these people, because before that, really, realistically, I mean, we're not talking about the giant here, we're talking about the giantess. We don't know that she's actually done anything wrong, so in a way she's being driven by a sense of revenge for the death of her husband. um so that's one way of consequences coming back. The other way, as you say, the woods themselves are offing the wife. um
Yeah.
so in a sense they both work, um, in their own different ways. So I suppose it's sort of, what do you prefer?
Yeah. And I think that when people unfairly besmirch Into the Woods because they have this high ideal that it was going to be like a straight from Broadway adaptation rather
Mm,
than like
mm,
essentially Phantom of the Opera. Because essentially it's much closer spiritually to Phantom of the Opera than it is Chicago, where in Chicago the changes are so big that they work because it almost creates a different show. Like I don't know if people were expecting a chorus line where it's like a one for one, but they mess with some stuff, um, which didn't work
mm,
in a chorus line, the film. But
mm,
it's just, I really want to talk about Into the Woods because this was like the 2014 Christmas season film that was really
mm,
touted, and it took the idea of an ensemble cast and it almost made it this highly billed um, thing. And I think that was part of the mistake was casting all these well-known actors for something that at its heart is an ensemble thing where there's not really one story that should be over another. Like they all get moments and they're all interwoven. That's
yeah,
the conceit of the show. And like I didn't mind not having the narrator there, but it was kind of weird not having the narrator, not having the baker's dad, because they have some somewhat integral side plots to the
yeah.
stage play itself. Like that was a choice where I'm more willing to wrestle with whether it was a good choice or not over how the baker's wife died and if that
Mm.
is actually the end of Act One, which I think it is
I,
personally.
I do wonder. You were saying about it. It came out as the sort of a Christmas season film, and you were saying about the ensemble cast, and it was filled with like well-known names and such. I wonder if that harmed it in its own way, because that I know particularly here in Britain with our tradition of pantos and such. I don't remember it getting much hype over here in 2014, and I almost wonder whether some people would have seen this big list of names and such and heard about like a new fairy tale musical. I do wonder whether they almost might have seen it as a sort of film Christmas panto and
Yeah.
therefore not treated it as an actual serious film with quite a lot of heavy themes in it. Um, but like I said, I don't recall it getting a lot of attention when it was over here. But then again, it might have been overshadowed by things in 2014. I'd have a check and see what
Yeah.
was out
And
then.
we don't really have a Christmas panto tradition in America. That's the other part of it, is that like we see musicals at Christmas time, but only if they're being offered that year. Um, I remember the year when Phantom of the Opera came out as a film. Like people were as obsessed with it as they were um, with the stage musical, but it had a really different reception. The more that we see of Phantom of from that timeline, like the less people seem to enjoy it, and the more I see of Into the Woods, the more I seem to enjoy it. Um, and I don't know if that's me being a fan of Anna Kendrick. I don't know if that's me being a fan of Stephen Sondheim or what it is. I mean, the only cast member that had done musicals up to that point that we knew about really was Anna Kendrick as Cinderella. She was the only one that we knew could sing. Because I think, except for Meryl Streep doing a song in Death Becomes Her, Meryl Streep had never really sung on film before. And James Corden in 2014 wasn't really a big late night talk show host. He'd
No,
done, I can't even remember what he'd done by the point in
well,
2014. So,
he might have got taken on for that because so his star was rising at that point. But before that, he was one of his most well-known things is he was in History Boys here in the UK. He was one of the original cast members, so he did have quite a solid theatre background. On a minor note for our LGBT listeners, Russell Tovey was one of his castmates in the History Boys. That Russell was one of the other original boys, along with Dominic Cooper as well.
who's played some really great queer roles, queer coded
Yeah,
roles. Dominic Cooper, I could do a whole show about him,
yeah.
not just because of Preacher, but because of other things he's done. And I think this is a good time to talk about Chris Pine and Billy Magnuson as the lecherous, untrustworthy princes. Something I like about Into the Woods, especially, is the way this frames. It's not an Arthurian legend. It doesn't frame knights and royalty as good. It almost frames them. They're not quite the villains, but they're definitely scumbags. Um, but they're scumbags that rip their shirts on waterfalls, and I can't hate them for that.
Mm.
Agony and Agony Reprise are two of the probably funniest male duet songs in all of
Mm.
musical theater, anyways. I think the Reprise is better than the first one because you don't quite expect the first one, but the second one I think is funnier for me. So,
Mm. Indeed, indeed. It's fascinating. You've got these two brothers who are they're clearly jealous of each other in different ways, or at least acknowledge each other as almost like their competition. And that was sort of how it was with some historic princes. At times, they would see themselves as competition for
yeah.
each other, and that sort of carries through to this. As you say, it's almost an anti-Disney trope in a sense
Yeah.
that what they do here, and that's something I quite enjoy about Into the Woods. That it almost feels like this is a counter to how Disney has taken fairy tales in, like the different decades that they were producing fairy tale movies. They were popularizing their own twists where there was added layers of goodness in what they were doing as opposed to traditional fairy tales which were more probably more closer actually to sometimes what Into the Woods actually does.
And
So
Into the Woods always feels a little closer to, except for with the murder, Lion in Winter. which I know I've talked about a little bit. It also feels a little bit closer to the Rocky and Bullwinkle fractured fairy tales, which is
Yeah.
really the first time in America, at least, that I can think of where we got a version of fairy tales that were more nuanced, more critical, and
Mhm.
almost more modern. The fractured fairy tale version of Rapunzel is essentially a feminist, uh, which even in this version of Into the Woods, this Rapunzel is kind, but I don't know that I don't know this Rapunzel would be pointed at to hold up the ideals of feminism necessarily. Um,
Mm,
but she does go through quite a lot, the poor girl, who has a
yes, she
brother.
does.
Because the baker gets told that he has a sister that is
Mm,
unnamed, but I don't know that Rapunzel is ever told that she has a brother that is a baker.
mm.
I don't know if that ever happens because I the witch is so concentrated on keeping Rapunzel isolated.
Yes.
Yes.
Mm. That it gets to the point where you do wonder if she knows. Who knows? Um, but yes, the poor girl goes through a lot, especially when having to deal with her prince. I say with air quotes.
Yeah.
Um, so you've got these two men that are engaged, that are brothers. They're engaged in very hyper masculine strutting against each other. It almost feels like two peacocks, like parading themselves against each other. You know, spreading their tail feathers against each other. I don't know what they're exactly competing against, except each other at that very moment when they're on the waterfall.
Yeah.
Um, but the thing is, there's like homoerotic undertones as well, in underlaying the whole thing, as they're acknowledging each other's like um, attractiveness almost. But it all comes together in a very toxic masculine
And
package.
they're very honest. One of my favorite lines that
Mm,
I don't know that they did service to in the film
mm,
is I think it's in the reprise of Agni where one of the princes, and I like that I can never keep them like up straight, like as different. Like I know in the film because Chris Pine and Billy Magnuson look so different, I can keep them. But like in the stage show, they're virtually interchangeable. And one of them says, "It's not like your thing with dwarves," and the other one goes, "Well, dwarves are very upsetting," and it's very like it's very tongue in cheek. It's very like a wink and nod to the masculinity thing, but it's
mm,
also about kind of how human and frail and not heroic they are. Into the
mm,
Woods, the film changes this a little bit because Billy Magnuson stays with Rapunzel, um, whereas Chris Pine does leave the woods because he's
mm.
being punished by Cinderella, punished by Anna Kendrick. If I remember correctly, and I didn't watch the film like I should have before we did this. Um, but if I remember correctly, in the Into the Woods, in that finale piece, Billy Magnuson is there with, uh, I think it's Rapunzel without any hair, because I believe the witch shaves it off. Like he's still with her, and so he's in the finale. And I
Mm.
don't think that happens in the stage show. I could be very wrong. Sondheim and Broadway people don't want to rip me apart for my inaccuracy. That's perfectly fine because I'm happy to be wrong. But it is different because really only one prince is a scumbag throughout the whole film, and that's Cinderella's prince. And
Mm.
Chris Pine plays a great. Chris Pine is playing his character from Horrible Bosses too, essentially, where he plays a scumbag, but this is a
Mm.
scumbag in period wear with tights, and I'm not mad about it. So
No. In the stage adaptation, from what I recall, um, the princes both scumbags. They go off with with two new princesses.
yeah, they go off with Snow White
Um,
and
Sleeping
Sleeping
Beauty.
Beauty. Yeah,
That's it.
uh,
Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I don't know why they did that change in the film because, in a sense, like their actions up to that point had been quite on par
yeah.
from what it looks like with the Broadway show.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I think it was because I don't because I can't speak for Rob Marshall, but it feels like it's part of the Disneyfication of the film. And
mm,
like with all things that Disney does, there is Disneyfication. Um, except for in like really hidden gems like Atlantis: The Lost Empire. there's not as
Mm,
much self-awareness in Disney films as you want, and they do make choices that tend to be safe, tend to be about the money. Even films like Frozen that are poking fun at its own princess culture, it was safe to poke fun because everybody was poking fun at that point.
mm,
So it has probably a lot to do with things that Disney either wanted or things that Rob Marshall thought would be fine for the movie. I don't think it harms it necessarily that Billy Magnuson is only toxic when he's around his brother. Because some families are like
mm.
that, where you'll have a guy that's not a bad guy, but then you put him home, and all of a sudden he's 15 again, and he's gross. So it's one of those things
Yeah.
where that's almost it's a choice, but I don't think it distracts and is so bad. I like the fact that within this movie of
Mm,
doom and gloom,
mm,
and in some ways about found family, there is almost a traditional romance with
mm,
Rapunzel and her prince. I think the scene in the swamp, especially when they're searching for each other and he's blind and she's like crying out for him. I think that's a great scene. It's a sad scene.
mm,
It's a hard scene to watch, but I don't think that's a bad scene. Um,
mm.
and I think it's interesting that one prince chooses to stay and the other one is, you know, continues to just be. I do like that he said, "I was raised to be charming, not sincere," and I think that's a really
Mm,
important. I think they do really important work in the show. So like it's
yeah.
one of those things where like I'm not as mad with that change as like Sondheim purists are. Like if there were things I were to be angry about, like that's just very low on my list of things.
Indeed, indeed. Um, yeah, it's interesting because you say about like the home culture about the princes and such,
Yeah.
and that's the thing. It's the reinforcing of if we're talking about the royal family here, the reinforcing of like their superior values, their superior status, almost. And that there's something to be said actually about the fact that as well, traditionally, it was all about the royal family continuing to propagate, wasn't it? To make sure they had heirs and everything. This is sort of like taken a few steps up um, because they're going out and sowing their oats
And
wherever they
what's
want.
and
But
what's interesting in the show, they don't really ever interact with the baker, who is the one who is infertile, who is the
mm,
one who has like actual, honest, hardworking lessons to learn.
yeah,
The closest they ever get is the baker goes to the steward to warn him about the giants coming down out of the sky.
yeah,
Um, but like the male character that the baker interacts with the most, especially in the film adaptation, is Jack, and then his
mm,
own son, who are both these really young. It's always kind of weird to me that Little Red Riding Hood and Jack are adults cast as these younger characters to play, because then they
mm,
always get these super. I don't know if you've ever heard a recording of Giants in the Sky, but you have to be a really great countertenor to master that song.
mm,
I can honestly see Jonathan Groff doing it, but it just yeah, it's one of those things where it's kind of this weird movie that is not about masculinity, but in a way it
mm,
definitely is. It's about the curse. It's about what it means to propagate your seed in a lot of ways. It's about the
mm,
traditional values that we see of masculinity in fairy tales. Even the idea of,
mm,
um, the witch isn't evil necessarily. She is aggrieved, and that has turned her vengeful. But so is the giantess.
yeah,
Both of them honestly have a lot writing in this show. They have a lot that you know. I'm not saying the witch is perfect. She's definitely not perfect by any means, but
no,
her revenge makes sense. Um, and the baker is also toxically masculine. He refuses at the beginning to want his wife to go into the woods with him. She follows him in spite of his direct orders that she not. Um,
mm,
but she recognizes that's a lot about his fear of the woods, and that's a lot about
mm,
his loss of family. So like I like that no one in this show is perfect. I like that Jack can be goaded into going back up into the beanstalk. I like that the princes aren't great except for Blee Magnuson. Um, I feel like the only character who's almost virtually word for word the same is probably Cinderella and maybe Cinderella's stepmom and stepsisters. I
Mm,
think that is the only one that stayed really incredibly intact. And it was a lot of time in America, especially. It was the first time people had come across the Cinderella story where the mom had a grave that had the tree, and it was the
mm,
golden slippers and a gold dress instead of the glass slipper. Because in America, Cinderella canon is usually about the glass slipper, and it's the very nice
yeah.
Prince song,
Ooh.
the yeah, like the pitch, like throwing pitch on the stairs, throwing tar on the stairs to trap her after the third night of the festival when she's running away. It's a great set of songs. It was practically made for Anna Kendrick's voice in a lot of ways too. So
Ooh. What you've just mentioned about glass slippers this main thing, and this might be actually something we can talk about in a future podcast episode. The fact is that for a good number of people, American fairy tales are pretty much the retellings that Disney have put in place because of the popularity of the movies that they created, to the point that their versions of the tales have influenced a lot of the future retellings because people look to the elements that Disney had in, say, Cinderella, in Sleeping Beauty, etc. And they don't copy it, but they pay homage to those versions because that's what people have almost grown up with and what they recognize as that. Which is not true. There's a lot of different versions of Cinderella and Beauty and the Beast, etc. But I think that might be a very interesting topic to cover in the
well,
future.
and it becomes center of the critique too. Like if we were to talk about Cinderella, the 1950 Disney version versus Ever After, a Cinderella story with Angelica Houston as the stepmom and Drew Barrymore as Danielle. Very fantastic, not magical version of
Mm,
Cinderella. Or if you were to look at the 2015 live, I think it was 2015, the live action one
yeah.
featuring oh god, what's it, Richard Madden as
Oh,
the prince.
oh,
Yeah,
Richard,
which we could talk about a lot. But it's the idea of
those pies.
in America, um, we do have the Disney-fied version of things, and it actually
Yeah.
takes time to get yourself out of that mindset. The idea of two is that the critique of the things comes out of the Disney version, not the original version. So the
Mm,
critique of Cinderella, um, which is almost revolutionary in Into the Woods in 1986, is almost still revolutionary in 2014 in the film because many people hadn't heard that before or had only heard that about kind of the glib Saturday Night Live version of it. Like the concept of fairy tale, the concept of magic, the concept of it's not about the fact that it's the slipper um, that fits directly to her feet, but people like hyper focus on like why a magic slipper made for her doesn't stay on her foot. The idea is about her and the prince and how he now has to find her.
mm,
And so Into the Woods does a lot of great work. And a film adaptation was always going to have a longer road to go because it does take place in a more 3D space. You're surrounded by the woods. It's not, it's not a cutout Hollywood style flat and you really know you're watching a play. It's kind of like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang where it takes place in a world and it's almost not served by having a complete 3D world. You
mm.
kind of need a fake cow to make it to kind of create the absurdity, like having a real cow that is milky white that moves that is CGI'd almost takes away from things. I think the only time where it really serves, where it really worked, was the Cinderella song with the pitch on the stairs that Anna Kendrick did so well, where she's standing alone and she's singing about making a decision about whether she wants the prince to kind of keep her and trap her or not. Like, and also Meryl Streep's transformation into beautiful Meryl Streep, from ugly hag witch Meryl Streep to death becomes her beautiful Meryl Streep with the great purple dress and the purple stuff in her hair. I think that's really what is served well by the film adaptation, because then you can really go all out. But there are some things like having the cow be real, be CGI'd, that doesn't necessarily serve as well. But I don't think there's another way to really do it, because when you start going too far afield in fairy tales, you get Beauty and the Beast meet CSI, where the Beast is living in the sewers, like in the 80s. You know,
Oh God,
it's one
yeah,
of those
I
things
forgot
where
that.
you gotta be like, you need to temper your expectations. Like, I was going to see this movie in 2014 because someone else was buying the ticket, and it was a holiday film, and I was getting away from my family for 2 hours. Yes, I was going to see Anna Kendrick, but a lot of it was about the entertainment of being away from the people that I had been looking at the whole week. Um, and the bonus was Billy Magnus and Chris Pine ripping their shirt. I also didn't hate Emily Blunt in it. I think she's better as a baker's wife than she is later as Mary
Mhm.
Poppins. Um, but also, I had never heard her sing before, so I had absolutely no expectations. The only person I had expectations for was Anna Kendrick, because she had been singing for a long time, and I had seen her in
Mm.
camp, and I had seen her in YouTube shows doing Broadway stuff when she was even younger. Like, I knew she was essentially trained to be in this movie. Like, so I had a lot
Yeah.
of faith in her, and everyone else was like, sure, fine, why not? Meryl Streep, Johnny Depp. That's I thought Johnny Depp was a weird casting choice as the wolf. Like, when I think about like a strong, hyper masculine, super sexualized Hollywood actor, like Dwayne the Rock Johnson as Bambi in the SNL skit would have made more sense as the wolf for me. But Johnny Depp is inoffensive in this movie as the wolf. Like, I don't think he's bad. He's not the choice that I would have made. I probably would
I
have cast KGZ 87. Like, I would love to see like a version of the film with
yeah.
KGZ, and like having a masculine male Riding Hood would be really interesting. To completely
Mm.
change the casting and do male on male duet at that point would be fascinating.
Mm.
And I guess you'd want to make it Hello Little Boy instead of keeping it Hello Little Girl. But if you did trans casting, or if you did a feminine male that was doing that work, you could probably still keep it Hello Little Girl. But it would be interesting to do it with two male characters to see what that looked like. No one has done
Mm.
that I've seen. So
No, I quite agree. You can't. What you say conjures images in my mind. I totally see it.
I mean,
You don't
people have been
use
doing it with Dylan O'Brien and Tyler Hoechlin since the beginning of Teen Wolf. So it's not like there's no precedent in fandom for a male twink Red Riding Hood and a big bad angry alpha beta wolf. Like, there's precedent for it in pop culture. Like, it's a weird Superman
Whereas
Batman sexualization dynamic too that happens. So like, it's a whole thing. Like, I don't know how to describe it otherwise. So
oh days. Um, so I can see that we're coming up to the hour mark at the second. So should we wrap up our thoughts on it, sir?
sure. We have a couple left. We have, you wanted to talk about the idea of found family, and we can also talk about,
Mhm.
I think the ending should be talked about a little bit, and I think they kind of dovetail into each other. I want to look at,
Yes.
see, and make sure
So
all of your notes. Um, yeah, I think,
it's sort of well, it's sort of trying to work it all in together towards the end, sir, as
yeah,
well.
you could talk about that. You could talk about the idea of utopia and anti-utopia, the idea of found family.
Mhm.
Like, yeah, we can wrap this up with the idea of the ending of it, which is the ending is a reprise essentially of First
Mm.
Midnight. It starts off with Last Midnight, and it
Mm.
ends with the characters committing gianticide essentially and murdering a giant, but they still, oddly enough, get a happy ending. What are your thoughts on the happy ending at the end of Into the Woods?
Is it really that happy though?
Well, not for the
Because I,
giantess. Like, the giantess doesn't have a good time.
but I don't think it's happy for anyone, to be honest. Because so if you think about it, by the end of the movie, everyone's lost loved ones. Everyone's lost family members. Jack's mother's dead. The baker's wife is dead. Snow White. What am I talking about? Little Red Riding Hood has lost her mum and her grandma. Like, all of the different families have been shattered, and everyone's had loss. I mean, that's what culminated in that massive and very engaging blame game that you
Yeah.
get. just before last midnight, which to
If
let
you've
I'll
never
be
heard Your Fault, by the way, is one of the best
yeah, yeah.
ensemble. It's as good as Tonight is in West Side Story, or as La Resistance from South
Yeah.
Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut is. Like, it's one of the best ensemble talking over each other musical numbers
Mm.
probably ever written. So
And it's super engaging. And you can, unfortunately, the fact is that everyone is right. You know, everyone is right in the different points they're saying. They're being very self-centered about it and not admit, as the witch says, they're not willing to take responsibility for their own actions. But what they point out in what each other has done is true. And and by the end of the movie, as you say, they've committed giant side, and they're left to pick up the pieces. They become a found family. The baker, um, Jack, Little Red Riding Hood. I think Cinderella.
yeah, Cinderella's like,
So
I don't really want to live in a castle. I kind of like cleaning up. I just don't want to be abused for it, kind of thing. So yeah,
she takes on a mother role, but I sort of can't help but think, from her perspective, she felt she has to, because like the kids don't have anyone anymore. And yes, the baker is starting to sing to soothe his son, but that's because they've all lost something and they're all trying to hold on to something now, and they're trying to move on from all of the mistakes they've made to make something better than what they've had. But they're trying to make something better because they've all fallen to pieces.
and
So
it is a bittersweet ending. It's not a happy ending in that
no,
traditional sense of any kind. It's not the ending of Little Mermaid where Ariel and Eric are getting married. Um, but
it's not the original Little Mermaid ending.
it's not the original Little Mermaid ending where she dissolves into foam, or what have you. It's one of those things where I think it's a good ending to struggle with because there are notes of happiness in it. There's the idea of these people do have each other and the rest of society has cracked around them. Even though they are responsible for the cracks in society, they're still happy. This is also kind of the moment where you see glimpses of the baker being more real, more of a complex character than a fairy tale character, because he starts telling a fairy tale to his son. And yes, he's lost his wife, but she's also, they don't really spend the play. They spend the play being very honest with each other.
Mm,
Um, Other characters are really funny with each other, or they're really combative in a humorous way. There's a lot of humor in this play that we're not really even gonna get time to touch on. But when I think about the baker and his wife, they spend a lot of the play figuring out how to even talk to each other. In my mind, I don't think it's bad. I think it's a really interesting take on how to do an honest real world relationship in a fairy tale universe. And it's
mm,
very cohesive with the other relationships in the universe, especially with like Jack and his mom and the mother's expectations of survival versus Jack's kind of idea of whimsy. Um,
mm.
but I don't know. It's just one of those things where like the baker feels like a better match to me with Cinderella, and it could be just my love for Anna Kendrick blinding me to the actual story itself. Um, but there's something really interesting about who survives and who doesn't survive. Because
Mm,
earlier in the play, Cinderella's stepsisters essentially chop off their own heels to try to fit in the magic shoe, and they both get their eyes pecked out by birds. So they're alive, but they're blind. And their mom is dead, who is played by Christine Baranski in one of the most interesting Wish She Was There More cameos. Shout out to Christine Baranski for her work on both The Grinch and The Big Bang Theory.
yep.
Um, yeah, it's one of those weird things where, like, I think I think if anything could have been Disneyfied more in the film, it could have been the happy ending. Like, instead of being in the woods at midnight singing to each other in a group, they could have actually, like, if Rob Marshall had really wanted to Disneyfy it, he could have had like the sun coming up and like the things breaking through trees instead of leaving it on kind of that bittersweet note. But found family is kind of complicated like that. Like
Mm,
a lot of, like, if you look at something like Queer as Folk, That's a found family, but that's also a very complicated, not always good for each other found family.
No.
It really does subvert an expectation of what you think a happy ending should be. And I kind of like that, really.
Mm, I do as well. Um, so something like to put one of my main points out there of why I think this is a really good film. Um, a really good adaptation as well. So the whole premise of Into the Woods is challenging the very notion of the utopia of the happy ever after. Um, they do it by not just the fact that they show a happy ever after, they're showing the consequences and the mistakes that people have made in pursuit of their dreams and such. Um, when you think of like the traditional fairy tales and such, it is a utopic feeling. They look at Cinderella, look at Sleeping Beauty. They do that, and any time that they've shown the after for any of those tales, they you know they've been thriving, they've been living. Whereas Into the Woods almost feels like a counterpoint to that. It's sort of like an anti utopian feeling. Um, and that's what makes it so fascinating to watch. And because there's a very much, despite how whimsy and fantastical it is, there's almost a very realistic element to Into the Woods. Um, and we've touched upon like the dare I say, the survivors of the giantess's wrath, like them picking up the pieces afterwards and trying to make something of their futures now and carry on. It feels like a far more real version of Ever After when the finale comes to a close. Um, and you sort of get the impression that while they'll probably have to shoulder what happened for the rest of their lives, at least they've actually been able to start addressing what they did, and they will be able to move on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for me too, it's not just about the story; it's about the score. For me, I
Yeah.
think this is one of Sondheim's. I don't want to call it a hidden gem because I don't think it's so hidden. It's not like
No.
Passions or Assassins. Um, but I think when people think of Stephen Sondheim, they think of Company, A Funny Thing Happened, Sweeney Todd. I think Into the Woods deserves a lot of credit for the work. The music in this play, the pacing of it, the honesty of it, the Stephen Sondheim of it all. Um, there's a lot of really great tongue in cheek that comes from his songs. Anything
Mm,
the Cinderella sings, anything the princess sing, the ensemble work. Like I don't think I can stress enough how in some plays there's really no ensemble cast. It's two leads and then everybody else. This is an
mhm.
ensemble show. Giants in the Sky, done by Jack, is unforgettable. Um, and Jack is a main character, but isn't because none of them are really the main characters. And that is
No.
one of the things that you kind of have to grapple with when you see this as a film, is that Rob Marshall did choose to, it feels like more of a highlight where the catalyst of it is more the baker and his wife, and everyone else is slightly more supporting. But I don't think that distracts. Um, yeah,
I would almost say that it feels very much like what real life is like. You may have at some points, like some people take center stage for a bit, and a situation does like it's heavily influenced by their actions, but no one is an island by themselves. And it's more realistic to see multiple people like impacting on each other, influencing each other's actions, and ending up afterwards with an event that has become the result of multiple people and their actions, and which is actually what we see
yeah,
in Into the Woods, especially at the ending when they get into this that whole tangle, and they're like they can't, they're trying to blame everyone else but themselves, but they can't do that because it is the result of
yeah.
everyone.
To go from a song like Your Fault, where one of the characters is literally saying, "Don't look here," like don't blame me, don't even cast your
Mhm.
eyes on me, to the
Yeah.
idea of no one is alone and having an ensemble cast sing the finale, which it doesn't feel like in the stage show. It's definitely a finale ensemble cast song,
Mm.
whereas in the film adaptation, it definitely feels more Cinderella heavy. But then again, that's casting. That's partially what it comes down to. When you have Anna Kendrick, you want to end with
Mm.
some of your biggest voices.
Yeah.
Um, and I think I think it's important. I think it's at least as important in Sondheim canon as Follies, maybe more important than West Side Story, which I know is really controversial because people
Mm.
really liked that remake. But for me, when I think of Sondheim, I think Into the Woods is more successful than some of his more mainstream work in some ways. I certainly
Yeah.
think it has more important iconography to it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
It's definitely an adaptation that hasn't had its due. And if we're going to talk about bad adaptations, it's astronomically higher than anything that Cats would ever reach.
Yeah.
If we're talking
And
about
we'll be talking about adaptations. We're doing Mythic May. Really is what May is about. Mythic May, and so that's why we're also going to be talking about another adaptation that Disney has done. Coming up, a little bit of a preview. We're going to be talking about one of both of our favorite shows, but for different reasons, and some reasons that very much dovetail into each other. Next episode will be about Once Upon a Time, which I know
Woo!
people. Yeah, it's not Fables. It's Once Upon a Time. So if you're expecting Fables, that'll be a whole other show altogether because it's definitely different. But we will be talking about Fables a little bit because I think you need
Yes.
Fables in context, and I think Into the Woods gives a little context into what Once Upon a Time is as well, because all things influence each other. That's how pop culture works.
Yeah.
And so I know there was no real agony today except for with Zoom, but I appreciated being with you, Magnus, and getting to talk a little bit about one of my
Mm.
favorite Sondheim shows, one of my favorite Broadway shows, probably. And I hope that you have a great and wonderful week. Is there anything you'd like to plug before Zoom kicks us off?
Mm. No, I don't think I want to necessarily do too much self promotion at the moment. I'll save that for another time.
Okay. Well, another time, another place, another rhyme, another way. And I want to thank everyone for listening. Please continue to reach out to us via Instagram, via Twitter. Don't forget, we have the archive on the YouTube, where if you click on the YouTube Google search bar, you can find Everything is Gay podcast pretty easily. If you type in Everything is Gay podcast, we're like the second result after the ad, at least for me. And maybe that's just because I search it all the time to find the link to share. But yeah, listen, thank you for listening to us wherever major podcasts are sold. If you have something really near and dear to your heart you'd love us to talk about, don't hesitate to reach out because we want to talk about what matters to us, but what matters to you. And I always want to find out about new stuff that I'd like to see and hear about.
Mhm.
Particularly right now, I'm watching the first episode of Outer Range, which is Noah Reed and Josh Brolin doing like a sci-fi western thing, which is really cool. And apparently Noah Reed's going to be in his underwear singing "Angel of the Morning," which I'm
Ooh.
very excited to get to as an episode because I'm shameless. And I'm going to end this episode of our podcast with me being completely shameless and enjoying that visual. And we'll talk to you all next time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Au revoir.
Au revoir, indeed.